Hello, I'm Bill Bouchaw, Executive Director for the National Assessment Governing Board. Welcome to today's event, Lessons Learned from the National Assessment of Education Progress, a discussion with urban school leaders. Today's presentation is co-sponsored by the Governing Board and the Council of Great City Schools, with important support from the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES. The Governing Board was established by Congress in 1988 and sets policy for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as the Nation's Report Card, or by the acronym NAEP, N-A-E-P. Among other responsibilities, the Governing Board decides what grades and subjects to test and is responsible for reporting the results to the American public. And the Governing Board works very closely with NCES, which is responsible for administering the assessments. We have a great program planned today, but before that, let me provide a little bit of background. Last October, we released the most recent NAEP results for math and reading, and we documented important achievement gains in a few of our larger urban school districts. These school districts participate in a special program within NAEP known as the Trial Urban District Assessment, or TUDA. Today, we will talk with leaders from these districts to better understand initiatives underway in their school districts that they believe could have had the most impact on these improvements. Our partner in today's event is Mike Casserly, Executive Director for the Council of Great City Schools, and he'll engage in a lively discussion with education leaders from Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, the District of Columbia, and the Miami-Dade Public Schools. But before going further, I'd like to make an important announcement. Given the success of the TUDA program, the President requested and Congress authorized providing additional funds to add 6 more districts. And that'll bring TUDA from 21 to 27 districts that will be engaged. And these are districts, and this is important to note, these are districts that volunteer to participate. Our 6 new districts include Clark County School District in Nevada, which also, of course, includes Las Vegas, the Denver Public Schools in Colorado, Fort Worth Independent School District in Texas, Guilford County Schools in North Carolina, which includes Greensboro, Milwaukee Public Schools in Wisconsin, and the Shelby County Schools in Tennessee, which includes Memphis. And we know that representatives from these districts are watching this webinar today, and we applaud them and we welcome them to the program. And we know they will enjoy hearing from our panelists. But before we turn the program over to Mike, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Peggy Carr, who is the Acting Commissioner for the National Center on Education Statistics. And Dr. Carr will share with you more details about TUDA. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peggy Carr to the podium.
Good morning, and thank you, Bill. In my lengthy tenure with the program, I have not seen a component more significant and more impactful than the Trial Urban District Assessment. You now know that we nicknamed it TUDA. And it's not just me. When I performed the pre-briefings on these reports for the senior staff and the Department of Education, the Secretary of Senior Staff, they're standing room only. And Congress, congressional staff, and I should say, most pointedly, the White House never turns down a briefing on TUDA. The media, always highly attended when we do the press release. So TUDA is important. It's important to all of us. And this is because we all know that it's the TUDAs that represent the heart of this country, where the highest proportions of our minorities and our low-income students go to school. So the TUDA program started back in 2002, and I'm just going to say right up front, it was Mike Casserly who envisioned the TUDA program and came and made a very, very convincing presentation to the National Assessment Governing Board and the National Center for Education Statistics that this is important and this is something that we should do. He has been, since then, a wonderful ambassador and a leader amongst the participants for the TUDA program, and he has watched very closely the utility of the data, the analysis of the data, and yes, the fiscal help of the data and the program as well. But I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the leadership of the districts themselves, that they agreed to participate in this TUDA program, and it was not easy to be under a microscope, to sort of look under the rock or the head of the car and look to see what's happening under the hood, because it was not always a pretty picture. But, I think the districts wanted to do this because they wanted to do what was necessary to help their students grow. And as Bill indicated, we have seen some really remarkable improvements amongst the tutors over the years. So through collaboration with NCES and NAEP and the Council of Great City Schools, this program has grown tremendously. In 2003, when we started the program, in 2002, I should say, we had about 5 and 6 if you count the District of Columbia. But when we started with reading and math in 2003, there were 10 TUDAs already, a 100% increase. And in 2015, we had 21 TUDAs. Now, a little bit about the eligibility for participation in this program. There are 37 districts in this country that are eligible to participate. And there are 3 major criteria that I want to share with you. The TUDA has to be in a city of 250,000 or more. The TUDA has to have about half of a student population to be minority, Black, or Hispanic, or eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Now, I know that variable is a little less reliable than before, but it's still part of the criteria thus far. And the TUDA has to be large enough to have us implement 3 subjects simultaneously doing the data collection for reading and math 4th and 8th grade. And again, we have about 37 TUDAs that are eligible. So with the addition of the 6 TUDAs that Bill implemented, we have a good bit of the TUDAs in the program. So the map that you see here displays that the TUDAs are representative of students around the country. And I should say that the large city comparison, which includes all of the cities in the country, not just these TUDAs, the TUDA program represents about half of the students in these large cities. That's pretty impressive, I would say. And by the time we add these additional 6, that number, of course, is going to grow. So when we started the program in the earlier years, we have had an opportunity to administer reading and math and science and writing in the TUDAs. And as Bill pointed out, when we released the 2015, we decided to add the TUDAs to the release, primarily because there were some real impressive gains that we noted in the TUDAs. Yes, it was the first time in the history of the program that we saw a decline in mathematics, a slight drop in mathematics, for example, since 1990. However, the TUDAs were resilient. And so I'm interested in hearing what our panel will have to say today. So I have an announcement. Since the 2015 release of the reading and math, we have released more data, additional data on the 2015 reading and math data for the TUDA. It includes analysis of trends of how students' performance and the students' demographics in these districts have changed over time. And there's a comparison to their home state, very interesting results. In addition to that large Central City national benchmark that I described earlier, and of course, the nation as a whole. As with other NAEP report cards, you will also get a more in-depth look at the findings for numerous subgroups and our contextual variables and how achievement gaps, yes, the achievement gaps have been changing over time. And I believe the website is indicated here on this chart. So, Bill, I think I'm going to turn this back over to you. I am looking forward to the discussion, the dialogue that we're going to have today. I want to hear more about how these TUDAs, your districts use NAEP data, and I'm going to be listening very closely to any tidbits you might have about how we can improve this program moving forward. Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Mike.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Bill. Before we get started, I really want to take a moment just to thank Bill Bouchaw and his team at the National Assessment Governing Board for their leadership on this program and for their leadership on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's been the gold standard for assessment in this country for many years, and they continue in that tradition, and I really appreciate their leadership. Also, a thank you to Peggy Carr and her great team at the National Center for Education Statistics. We work very closely together on the preparation of this data, the analysis of the data. Her team is absolutely first rate with the highest degree of integrity. And if it weren't for the National Center and for the National Assessment Governing Board, I think this program would not be seeing the success that it currently does. So thank you for the great work that you've been doing. I also want to thank or join Bill in congratulating the 6 new districts that will be joining this program in 2017, Las Vegas, Denver, Fort Worth, Guilford County, Milwaukee, and Memphis. As Bill and Peggy indicated, that will take the number of participating districts up to 27. We started originally at 5, and I would like to underscore the fact that this is all voluntary. This is not something that Congress requires us to do. There's nothing in federal or any kind of law that requires districts to participate in this program. This is all done because urban school districts are committed to improving the academic outcomes of their students. I have to say, when the Council of the Great City Schools initiated this effort back in the fall of 2000, there were a lot of people who really thought that we were crazy to start this. But we started it because, one, we as urban school districts wanted to demonstrate that we were fully committed to the highest academic standards for our urban kids. 2, we wanted to be able to compare ourselves with those who had many of the same challenges as the urban school districts that participate in this program. And 3, we wanted a way of being able to gauge the progress that we were making and to evaluate the reforms that we were pursuing in ways that could not be done under the 50-state assessment system that existed then and in some ways still exists today. So part of what we will talk about today is whether some of that initial promise has been realized. And joining me this morning is really a terrific panel. As Bill mentioned, the districts our panelists represent this morning have all made significant gains on the National Assessment of Educational Progress since 2013. We are honored to have them join us today to share their district's significant achievements and offer their insights about what helped produce them. To my left at the center of the table is Alberto Carvalho. He is the superintendent of the Miami-Dade Public Schools, the nation's 4th largest school district, which also has more than 350 schools with over 400,000 students. Also last Friday, I might note, Alberto was named as the winner of this year's McGraw Prize in Education. To Alberto's right is Janice Jackson. She is the Chief Education Officer of the Chicago Public Schools, where she also leads the school district's Network 9, which includes 26 schools and over 14,000 students. Chicago is one of those districts that showed very significant gains in 4th and 8th reading and math performance at the very same time that the state was either flat or declined. To her right, leading the district's efforts to equip teachers with resources and professional learning opportunities is Brian Pick. Brian is the Chief of Teaching and Learning for the District of Columbia Public Schools. And if you have followed the data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, you know that the District of Columbia Public Schools has seen some of the largest increases in the national assessment data of any major urban school district in the country. At the far side of the table is Donnie Tran. Donnie is the Assistant Superintendent of Professional Learning for the Boston Public Schools, where he focuses on developing the system and processes to sustain adult learning at every level of the school district. Boston also saw significant progress in 2013, and Boston is the only school district that I know of where the school district, after having been significantly behind the national average, actually caught the national average in 2 subjects and grades. And then to Donnie's right, an expert in urban education for more than 20 years, Karen Thompson is the Deputy Chief of Curriculum and Instruction in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District that saw significant gains at the same time that Ohio saw no gains at all in this last testing cycle. So, our panel of urban education experts. So, Alberto, I'd like to start with you. Could you just take a minute or so and describe the 3, 4, 5 things that your district did over the last few years to produce the gains that you saw on the last administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for holding this very important convening, Mike and Bill and Peggy. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Look, during a year when NAEP results across the country went down or were stagnant, certainly it's worth looking at those districts that saw significant increases, particularly districts with high levels of poverty, high levels of diversity, a strong percentage of students who are English language learners, as is the case in Miami, with over 79,000 students who are still mastering linguistic proficiency in English. So it is a fair question, what's working there? But more importantly, if we understand what's working there, the second question should be, can we amplify and replicate that level of success across the country, knowing that the circumstances and the demographics are very similar in many other urban, suburban, and rural areas. What's worked in Miami is really those elements that are known to us. I no longer believe that improving student achievement, transforming public education, elevating the caliber of teaching and learning, and moving the needle of educational attainment, I don't believe that that is any longer a skill set deficit. It's not that we don't know what must and can be done. It's a will-set proposition. The question is, do you have the courage, the political courage, to do what you know works? So we did what we knew would work. Number one, leadership matters. Over the past few years, I've replaced 80% of all principals in Miami-Dade County Public Schools. We are a huge system of over 400 principals. We've recruited, incentivized, retained instructional leaders who are data analysts, who understand instruction, who do daily class monitoring, curriculum reviews, who understand how teaching and learning happens at the granular, very organic level. Secondly, teacher effectiveness. I'm less concerned about teacher quality and qualification as I am about teacher effectiveness. To me, less important than a high-level degree is the teacher's ability and preparation, that moment to teach children who are diverse, who are poor, who come to the schoolhouse with a deficit already before kindergarten. And can we close those deficits quickly enough? So we've negotiated contracts with the unions in Miami to augment and amplify professional development opportunities, to partner with colleges and universities to prepare teachers early on the art and science of urban education, not just through the College of Education, one size fits all, but the art and science of urban education. The third level is support systems, both internal and external. So the safety net that will address the social affective issues that kids come to school with. And by that I mean partnerships with health organizations for early screening and diagnosis, partnerships with child care agencies that precede pre-K or kindergarten so that we know who the child is and the gaps that that child brings prior to them entering our school system. The creation of a parent academy, enabling parents with the know-how to protect, support their kids, providing an echo of learning beyond the schoolhouse, bringing in outside agencies, the faith-based community, Diplomas Now, College Summit, City Year, TFA, all of these local and external organizations to provide the safety envelope. The next element, critically important now more than ever, is that in poor communities, particularly now during a time of hyper-connected living, in poor communities, learning effectively stops with the last bell. And to empower those students to further augment their learning beyond the last bell, you need to provide them with digital empowerment. That's why we passed a bond during the recession, $1.2 billion bond, to bring a digital transformation, digital convergence to Miami-Dade. All schools are Wi-Fi connected. Digital content was approved early on. We put in Promethean boards with surround sound in every single classroom in Miami-Dade. And we have doled out now 150,000 devices to students with the appropriate digital content, allowing for simultaneous remediation and acceleration that transcends the last bell. I'll close by saying this, and I'm going to use a word that you used, which was, is the promise being delivered? And should we feel encouraged by the release of the TUDA data? The answer to the latter question is yes, we should feel encouraged, but we should not allow ourselves to sit in the shadow of yesterday's success, because the scenario has already changed. So inasmuch as the promise is being delivered, the dream is not yet fulfilled. We're proud of the fact that in 4th and 8th grade reading and mathematics, we soared when the rest of the nation fell. We're proud of the fact that we beat wealthier, less diverse districts in Florida and beyond, but with a graduation rate that exceeds the state's, and when you disaggregate that data for African American and Hispanic students, exceeds many urban centers and the state of Florida itself. We recognize the last 20% that we have to overcome will be infinitely tougher than the previous 80. And that's the next phase of the work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Brian?
Sure.
What's DC done?
By the way, I'm sorry, that was a Cuban minute.
It's all the rage.
Excellent.
Lots of people have talked and written about what it is they think has produced such substantial progress in DC, but you have been on the inside in designing all of that over the years.
Yes, this is my 8th year here, and I want to first thank you, Michael, for your leadership in the council. Thank you to Jim and Peggy for bringing this convening together and for the important work you do, giving us information and then asking us to act on it. Appreciate that. I also want to thank you for the snapshot that's on the screen. The light teal dot at the bottom there is DC Public Schools, and you will see the steep line that has occurred over the last 8 to 10 years in DC Public Schools. So some of the secret sauce that we call it of DC and the reform happening here, really 3 things I'd like to focus on. First is a tremendous amount of work around making sure that our schools are led by amazing school leaders and every classroom is led by an effective and highly effective educator. We've done a tremendous amount of work that has made a lot of noise around recruitment and retention, recognition and rewarding our teachers. We have now one of the best teaching forces in the country. I would put our force up against any force out there. They're extraordinary instructional designers. They connect with their students. They know the content and they know management. They know how to inspire their students to greatness. It's really a force that I'm quite proud of. If you'd like to read more about it, there's a recent report out called We the People, which outlines all of our human capital efforts over the last 8 years here in the nation's capital. Second piece, which we've been out on and ahead on, we were early adopters of the Common Core or college and career readiness standards, and we have a strong stake in the ground around rigorous academic content. We believe that curriculum matters. We believe that our teachers deserve high quality resources to elegantly adapt in their classrooms to meet their own style or their students' needs. And we have units of study and lots of resources to guide teachers in the day-to-day happenings of teaching and learning in their classroom. So rigorous academic content is our second stake in the ground. And third, we've done tremendous amount of work at the teacher level, the school level, around investing students and their families, their stakeholders, in their academic success. So in a key partnership with a local organization called the Flamboyant Foundation, we've really pivoted what it means to engage families in their students' success. This looks at having academic parent and teacher meetings that look at where their students are at and what they can do at home to support their students. These are home visits. We lead the nation in teachers going into homes to connect and learn about their students. So those three things have been what we've been focusing on for at least the last 7 years that I've been around is excellent people, rigorous content, and engaged and motivated students and families.
Great. I think Cleveland also does home visits as well.
We do.
So Janice, can you tell us the Chicago story? I think everybody at the moment is focusing on all of the financial challenges that the school district has, but while all of that is going on, you're actually teaching children better.
First, I appreciate you acknowledging that as well as inviting me. I'm excited about having an opportunity to talk about the great work that's happening in Chicago. When you speak about the Chicago story, locally and nationally, people do tend to focus on the financial crisis that we are managing ourselves through, which is a real crisis and obviously can threaten some of the gains that we've made over time. But if I had to speak about what the district has done over the past few years, it starts with leadership, which has been acknowledged already. Talent does matter. So we have several initiatives around recruiting high quality principals and also high quality teachers in our classrooms. But I would also attribute our growth, and I would say probably more important has been the focus on good old fashioned teaching. I would say the focus on the instructional core, linking what students need to know and be able to do. So the assessment piece, well, what happens daily in the classroom and the quality of the curriculum that our teachers have. So we started by raising the bar. A few years ago, we went from using local assessments that were normed just in the state of Illinois to focusing not only on NAEP, which had been around for a while, but looking at the MAP data and comparing ourselves not just to the schools down the street or the schools in our region, but looking nationally and also internationally. So for that reason, I think that it's really important that we push our students forward and we make sure that they not only realize the promise that public education can provide them, but also see themselves as global citizens. So we started with that. We changed our accountability system. We took it away from looking at our local test scores and we started looking at MAP. MAP was aligned to Common Core, so we doubled down on those standards, which was a major shift. We had been using the Illinois state standards for years, and like many states, those standards were not comparable to national standards or international standards, and that required a big shift in the teaching and the quality of principal leadership. So not only did we need principals who were expert instructional leaders and understood academic rigor, but principals who could create the conditions for teachers to be successful in the classroom. Like many of the other districts, I think we also had a very strong teaching and learning department who focused on not only adopting curriculum that was aligned to Common Core so that teachers had what they needed in order to be successful, but we created networks within our district where we would have not only teacher leaders who could lead that work at the local level in partnership with their principals, but we would have just more of a cadre of excellence within our district. So I believe we raised the expectations, doubled down on leadership, and we also empowered our teachers so that there would be sustainability. We had a lot of transition at the senior leadership level, as many large urban districts do. So it's really important to make sure that the people on the ground level who actually do this work are equipped and those changes are sustainable. So we're really proud of the growth we've made.
Great.
Yep.
Karen?
Sure.
Want to tell us the Cleveland has a very interesting story here because Cleveland was one of the districts for a good period of time that didn't see much growth on the national assessment. But this last time, you really took off.
Yeah, and so I would concur with what you've heard so far in terms of really building the structure for leadership and understanding. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about some different items that I think added to it. One of the things that we were engaged in, which was called the Cleveland Plan. And the Cleveland Plan gave our district some autonomies or flexibilities outside of state requirements and outside of some of our union contract pieces, that we were able to build in some flexibilities around really providing supports to our schools. I will say part of the work around the Cleveland Plan also brought a nonprofit separate agency that would do a local district report card on how we were progressing. And so it was the opportunity to work collaboratively with other partners and work collaboratively around a vision that involved not only internal but external stakeholders in the success of the district. And so that included one of the components that I think has been a big change for us is the expansion of our pre-K program. We're in our third year now where we're doing full day pre-K, and we've expanded to 65 of our 85 schools having a pre-K. But we're only still servicing about 50% of the students that come into our district. So we had to work really hard, and an entity was formed called Pre4CLE. Pre4CLE is a wonderful organization that has allowed us to partner with other agencies, Head Start programs, other daycare and preschool agencies in the city to provide that connector so that we had high caliber, high quality preschool programs. And we're all using a common curriculum that supports that student's growth, because the studies show if our students have that preparation and preparedness coming into kindergarten, they have a higher achieving or a higher acceleration rate. So that's been a big initiative that was birthed through the Cleveland Plan. Another component is in 2013, we got tired of being last. We really, our CEO, Eric Gordon, we spent a lot of time as a senior leadership team. We spent a lot of time with our teaching force. We spent a lot of time with our principals as academic leaders, really making that shift to leading academically and unpacking those results, drilling it down, looking at the release questions, looking at the complexity of the questions. And I think that coupled with our early adoption of the Common Core standards, belonging to a group such as Council of Great City Schools that allows us to partner with other districts that are doing things well, having those intentional conversations, really led to us approaching it in a much different format. And in light of a lot of assessments going on last year, for the first time, we were thrilled when we got the results and saw our gains in terms of where we performed as a TUDA district. And I think it's because it's not something that we look at every 2 years, but it was something that was a driver every day, every week at our senior leadership meeting. We have to present on our metrics, talk about the work. Every month when we bring our academic principals together and talk about the work and have focused instructional strategies around where we need to focus. And every week as an academic team, when we'll go out into our network schools, so we'll divide and conquer, and we're all attached to networks, and so we'll go out into our schools every week, not to evaluate the schools, but to evaluate our work and support to the schools. And I think all of those things have converged to having some sustainable growth. But we've got a lot of work to do.
Great, thanks, Karen. Donnie? Boston.
I keep on having to cross things out as other people say them, but I'm luckily left with still a rich list of things that we're really proud of in Boston. I want to echo the emphasis on pre-K as a major driver. We have a nationally renowned curriculum that, as a parent of a 4-year-old that's about to enter the system, I'm incredibly proud of and excited for the learning he's going to have. It's a play-based curriculum, but we've done some really powerful alignment to the academic skills and literacy skills that students will have to have in order to be successful in later grades. And so that's been a really powerful driver for some of the changes I think we're seeing downstream, which is a really incredible measure of the persistence of that effect, which I think research would suggest, is actually less clear than we might have otherwise believed. It's actually such a powerful curriculum, we actually export it to community-based partners. So we provide professional development as an example of one way to sustain quality in a mixed delivery model across the city of Boston, and have a lot of mayoral support in order to do that. I want to just resonate with the emphasis on really strong curriculum and really high quality instructional practice. We have, over time in Boston, and continuing on into this year and moving forward, developed a relentless focus on the quality of the task that students are being asked to do. And really always asking ourselves the question, who is doing the cognitive lift in this classroom? And trying to empower parents to ask those sorts of questions as well, in another example of community outreach, and empowering parents to really ask those sorts of tough questions of the people who teach their children. We similarly, just sort of mapping outwards, the task that students do has to be high quality, has to put the learning on them. At the same time, that focus on task has to be mirrored out to the adult learners in the system as well. And we have to teach the teachers in the system the way that we want them to teach and the way that we want them to engage their students in cognitively demanding tasks. And so trying to build that capacity throughout the system to make every adult leader a really powerful leader of learning has been a really huge part of our work, as we have also put curriculum in front of both students and teachers that show us what cognitively demanding tasks can look like that match up to the college and career standards that we are aspiring to. I think that's pretty much it. That already hasn't been said by my colleagues at the table.
Okay,
but thank you again for this opportunity.
Great. Before I ask you about NAEP specifically and how it is you use NAEP data to inform the progress that you're making, to assess whether or not your reforms are working, where it is maybe you need to put your professional development or interventions and the like, let me throw you kind of a ringer of a question. Each of you mentioned some similar things like preschool and curriculum and building the capacity of teachers and even willpower and the like. If I were to ask a number of other TUDA cities about that had not seen improvements in their NAEP scores, what they were doing, many of them would cite that they were doing many of the same things that you were doing. What sets you aside from the districts that have not produced gains? What's the difference in that set of practices that we can learn from to inform districts that are not making as much progress?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily compare ourselves. I don't know what other districts are doing, but I might pose a few questions.
You don't have to call out.
Yeah. but I might pose a few questions that I think will push their thinking and allow for the type of reflection that needs to be done within a district in order to answer that question. Number one, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, the power of our professional development for teachers, but really what's the level of collaboration, not only at the network level or district level, but within your schools? What are your expectations around that? I think one of the things that we've experienced in CPS, and I hope to continue this momentum, is that the teachers there's really been a convergence amongst the teachers of kind of coming together, taking ownership of, delivering high quality instruction. Our teachers have really bought into the promise of Common Core. They see a lot of value in the K through 12 continuum around skills, and we've seen that at both the elementary and the high school level. So I might pose questions just around how are they using data? What does collaboration look like? What are they focused on? And then also, how do you narrow the focus? In a large urban district, there are so many problems, so many initiatives, so many things going on. It's very easy to get distracted and try to do everything great. But I would ask, what is your niche? What is it that your district does well, or what is it that you're focused on? and then use that cycle of continuous improvement to make sure you're drilling down. I think that Chicago, although a very large city, has done a really good job of narrowing the focus, specifically around instruction. And it's nice to see that not only on local indicators like our assessments locally, we've seen more schools get off of probation, more schools out of academic warning. When we received our NAEP scores, we saw that as just validation of what we had already seen locally.
I will add to that is I agree. You're absolutely right, Mike. There's a lot of commonality about what successful districts do. And so I didn't talk about early childhood education. Years ago, we implemented universal pre-K in the state of Florida that was only 3 hours, so we used Title I funding to supplement and make it a full day. We elevated dramatically the credentialing requirements that the state provided for early childhood education from simply an associate's degree in Miami-Dade. You need a 4-year degree to teach the youngest kids. In addition to that, an element that I didn't speak about, but I think has been critically important, is shifting the district as a whole, but schools and within school culture, from the one-size-fits-all approach to one-size-fits-none. So dramatically explosive choice at all levels, transforming Miami-Dade into a portfolio district with over 500 magnet and schools of choice, providing students really an individualized pathway towards their own educational journey. That is very empowering of the student because the education then becomes relevant and always rigorous. But to your question, I think there are only two possible explanations. If they're doing the same thing that other successful districts are doing, then you have to ask, is the leadership at the very top being as bold as it needs to be, almost recklessly specific to the individual, to the benefit of the organization, meaning I'm going to do everything I can, even risk my position. I often tell my board, if I don't show up to work and do something crazy enough that will get me fired, but dramatically improve performance, I'm not doing my job. Or, so that's one reason, it could be a leadership or the fortitude with which you declare what you need to do. Or there's a breakdown somewhere in the continuum of performance improvement. Maybe it's specific to the data analysis and understanding, specific to the awareness of the condition, specific to the planning process, so what must we do? Or, and this is often the culprit, execution, fidelity. Do you have the systems in place to examine the practice at the school level? Do you have data chats that exist between teachers and students, teachers and principals and central office through Datacom-like, similar to CompStat, examination of data with rapid deployment of resources as solutions? So somewhere along the line, there's a breakdown. And where I've seen it more often than not is either strong advocate, student-centric leadership at the top, or a breakdown usually around execution, fidelity of implementation of what we know will work.
Yeah. Anybody else want to take a crack at this?
I would just add, I think that when you touched upon the data point, that's been a big change agent for us in terms of really making the data user-friendly, making it nimble, drilling it down to the student level and getting it to the schools as quickly as possible. Because if the teams are going to actively engage with that data and then make a change, make an assumption, have a conversation around it. And that's been one of the things that we've accelerated as a district in Cleveland over the past 2 years to make those reports when they're coming back very transparent, very user-friendly, letting them have the flexibilities to be able to do grouping and individualized grouping. And so, we're great at the district level and looking at things at the aggregate level, but just getting underneath it and truly understanding what's the purpose of this assessment, what's the purpose of this piece of data, and how is it relevant for the student, for the teacher, for the leader in the building. And so that's been a big change or shift for us in Cleveland.
I would second the thought around execution. In my office, I have a a stack of plans about this high, no kidding, of ideas and visions to reform the DC public school system going back to about 1901. And there's no lack of great ideas in those plans, and there's probably not a lot of new ideas that wouldn't be in those plans. It is the execution of those ideas, the focus, the execution, the vision. I'd also say that we're in a peculiar space where there is leadership and vision needed, which we're very fortunate in this city to have an extraordinary chancellor and the political support of that chancellor to provide stability. But at the ultimate heart of the work, it's the interaction between students, teachers, and the content day to day across about 3,000 classrooms in this city. And I like to say that there are two types of people in our system: teachers and those who help teachers do the very hard job of educating students in the classroom. So as much as time as attention, those three things I said hit at that instructional core of teacher, content, and students. And as much as we can support that interaction, that is where the heart of the work is.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question in a lot of ways, and one that I think a lot of people don't ask themselves very often, but I think this panel really put their fingers on it in emphasizing the role of leadership and the importance of leadership in creating the focus on academic improvement as the number one priority of the school system, and then the ability of the people in the school system to focus on quality instruction in the classroom. If you've got those two things at the heart of your work, you're likely to produce improvements in ways that others really haven't. Let me switch and ask you about NAEP itself and how it is you use NAEP data, what its value to you is. Some of you have touched on it already, but want to get a little more depth about how it is you use the NAEP data to inform your instructional program. Janice, do you want to?
I want to always go first. Sorry. Little. We use it in a variety of ways, but the two biggest ways is, number one, just as a means to level set, right? So it's called the nation's report card for a reason, and we take that very seriously. So again, we've been experiencing a lot of growth and success in Chicago public schools, while still noting that there's a long way to go. And so we're really excited to see the NAEP scores. You know, we want them to, we look for them to come out to really confirm that the work that we're doing on a daily basis is actually working and preparing our students not only to compete in Chicago, but to compete nationally. So that's one way. A second way, it's really to give a better measure for academic rigor. And in particular, one of the things that came out of our analysis of NAEP data is that we looked at first of all, early exposure to algebra and algebraic expressions and skills, et cetera, for our students. In Chicago, and this may be similar in a lot of urban districts, our students take algebra in 9th grade. But when we look at a lot of suburban districts or higher performing districts, we know that students actually take algebra sooner. So when we were looking at the data, we saw that when we made that shift to Common Core, focusing on algebra and those skills earlier, we saw the increase. So that gave us the confidence to continue to move forward with some of the programmatic changes. So putting more of a focus and trying to get schools to adjust their curriculum, looking at what they're offering in 7th and 8th grade, making sure that they're exposing students to algebraic expressions, principles, et cetera, a lot earlier. And that's just one example. In other ways, we looked at the data and saw that there may have been a gap between how Chicago students are doing, our very best and brightest students, how they're doing compared to their counterparts nationally. And again, that gave us the leverage to have conversations with some of our higher performing schools, because oftentimes they're left out of the mix in a large urban district. You tend to focus on the schools that aren't doing so well or the schools that need a lot of support. But you have to remember that, especially in a diverse district like Chicago, there are high-performing schools that have to be pushed as well. And we use the NAEP data as really a way to push that conversation, because they've really maxed out, for lack of a better phrase, at the district level.
So, great. After this round with the panel on the NAEP question, I'm going to invite people in the audience to come up to the microphone and ask a question if you have any questions. We also have an online audience, and we'll go to questions from them in a minute as well. So Donnie, do you want to talk about Boston and NAEP?
Yeah, I think we use it also to identify bright spots. The only thing I would add to the conversation before is we needed to go from random acts of excellence, things that are going well in like little spots, to building a system that supports teaching and learning, that supports the instructional core, that supports teachers. And looking at those bright spots, though, helps us understand the qualities of the system that support excellence in those pockets. So when we look at grades 3 through 5, 4 and 8, and where we notice that there seem to be improvements and with whom, that tells us something about the system that we can then dive more deeply into, doing some of these data dialogues that help us then extract lessons that we can apply system-wide. Not in a way that's generating or suppressing innovation, but it's creating coherence across the system. I think we are, many districts are, trying to find the balance between coherence and innovation, coherence and autonomy.
Yeah.
And every district is going to have to navigate the political reality of what the system will handle, what principals and teachers and community members will handle in terms of coherence or autonomy. But NAEP gives us a grounding to be able to make claims about coherence here mattered. So let's expand that coherence across the system. This curriculum worked. So let's spread it out across more schools in a way that respects their autonomy, but brings more additional coherence to the system.
Yeah. Alberto?
For me, the power of NAEP is a very real and easy one to describe. It's the most powerful diagnostic and to a certain extent even prognostic tool of macro performance validation. I'm able to look at the data and intuit from it. We are on the right path. We've made the right investments. We've made the right decisions. We executed well. But the power of NAEP also transcends beyond my own district's performance. I'm very interested, and I spend a lot of time actually looking at other districts' performances. Not the ones who are underperforming, but the ones who are overperforming in certain areas. There aren't many. But I'm very interested. Nothing is copyrighted or trademarked. So if it works there, I'm going to research it. He talked about his pre-K curriculum. And what struck me was it's fun. I want to know more about that. Because at 4 years old, you hope it's fun, right? So I'm always looking at the districts that in certain areas outperform Miami and try to learn from those practices and import them. I'm also looking for the leaders in those districts that are driving that work, and I want to hire them too. I'm going to be talking to you. And I think that's
Tommy,
the power.
I hope you're not watching.
So the power,
Talk to my wife.
the power of NAEP is not just the data itself, but it's the opening of doors to solutions. It was done there. What do they have in place that I may not have in place that I can bring here? And at the same time, can I derive from the data validation for my own practices, and can I defund those practices that are not working as a result of this data information, keeping it real and keeping it valid at a very macro level?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily familiar with NAEP don't really realize that in addition to providing district level performance data on reading and math in 4th and 8th grade, you also get very detailed information on African American students, on English language learners, on Hispanics, that you're able to compare, say, your English language learners or your former English language learners with English language learners in Los Angeles. You can ask very specific questions about what is this district doing that we're not doing. And it's those kinds of comparisons and trading of information and swapping of best practices across the cities that has really helped all of the cities improve their overall performance. And it's one of the great powers of NAEP that we really can't get from any other
Mike, it's what
assessment.
takes place at the Council of Great City Schools convenings, right? It's
Yeah, we do a lot of it.
Hey,
Yeah.
look at that NAEP data. What are you doing? And that's it's a powerful, very strong, resonating element of NAEP. It's not just your performance, but what other people are doing. And a dialogue alone informing the practices that are working and the ones that are not working cannot be ignored.
Yeah, I would also say it's not just NAEP data, it's specifically for us, particularly in DC, the TUDA data that's so powerful. Yeah. I'm very excited to bring on additional districts as additional comparison points and lessons learned. As a city, not yet a state, we compare ourselves to the folks at this table, and frankly, we can learn more from Chicago than Illinois as a whole, more from Miami than Florida as a whole, simply because of the transferability of those ideas.
Yeah. So that's, as an organization and as an alliance of school districts, this is what the big city school districts have been doing over the last number of years in order to improve our overall performance. And frankly, it's why we got into this in the first place, and why districts continue to volunteer for this is because of the quality of the data that NAEP provide and how it is we are able to use it to kind of spur each other on. So let me open this up to the audience. If you have questions, I'd like for you just to give us your name and your organization.
Hi, my name's Lou Ann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. I was curious, how do your districts handle the mental health challenges that I'm sure that you see every day in your classrooms?
That's a great question.
Yeah, anybody want to take that on?
I could start.
Cleveland has quite an extensive social emotional learning program.
Yeah, we've really spent a tremendous amount of time working around what we call our conditions for learning, social emotional learning environment, and it's been critical in helping us really start to see where we have pockets of need in our community, in our school communities in different ways, and has led to we now have 24, we call them community wraparound schools. And you do like an asset map of the neighborhood and make some determinations of areas where you see a need. Do we need a health center at the school because there's not easy access? Mental health agencies and some of the supports where schools where 50% of the student population has active cases with Family and Children's Services. And so there's some extra layers or extra needs there. And so the work that has been birthed out of our Conditions for Learning report in working with Dr. David Osher, he's just been a tremendous friend of the district. He works with a group called American Institute of Research, or AIR. But they've been just such a critical friend for the district in terms of really looking at, are we meeting the needs of our students? Do students feel challenged? Do students feel safe and secure? And many times they feel safe in their school, but it's some of the external factors that are going on in the community that we have to look at differently, and that brings a different conversation or different partnerships to the table. And so I think it gets back to what we were all talking about earlier, really looking at each school as its own community and what are those needs or supports that need to happen in there. And so the Conditions for Learning really helped us bring that to the forefront in a more meaningful, responsive way.
I'll give you a 30-second. We developed, actually at the beginning of this year, student success centers, hired 64 student success coaches with a strong emphasis on social work, psychological support, school-based clinics to deliver services to students and their parents, the community at large, in partnership with the University of Miami Medical School. In addition to that, a very robust and determined set of policies that eliminated this year, at the beginning of the year, outdoor suspensions, traditional outdoor suspensions, meaning the most troubled kids were declaring, we're going to keep you in, but we're going to address the root cause of issues that prompt that behavior. And the last thing that we did was a very deep partnership with the American Psychiatric Association and implemented a training program for teachers and counselors, 4,000 strong, and student ambassadors, on the early identification of troubled behavior, actually through a curriculum called Typical versus Troubled. That information, based on that early identification, is then referred to the student success centers, to the success coaches, or to social agencies to help the kid.
Okay. Susan?
Hi, Susan Sclafani, freelance consulting at this point. I'm wondering how you all address the issue of provision of time for teachers and principals to work together on all of these issues. That seems to be a major challenge across the country.
Yeah. Donnie?
We've invested heavily in our instructional leadership teams. So that's a contractually obligated structure that exists at every school. It has to include a teacher from each grade level or content, and the principal is the initial leader and lead facilitator of that work. And we have put a ton of resources and time and energy in teaching principals how to be collaborative leaders and how to empower the teachers in that circle, but specifically to actually model and talk through how they're going to take that facilitation and take it back to their teacher teams. And so that heavy investment is starting to pay off. We're seeing the sort of transmission line go from central office, where we're just empowering them with those collaboration skills, and seeing those teams really start to gel, and seeing the learning leaving those teams and going into the population of the school at large.
Yeah, Brian, did you want to
hugely
add to
important. Yeah, this year we created an Office of Instructional Practice, a cabinet level office. That one of the major cornerstones of the office is how do we better use time, both time for students, so extended school day, extended school year, but equally as important, the time that teachers are able to work together. And this is the nitty-gritty work of getting a schedule out, figuring out where students and where adults are going to be at the right time doing the right things. Tremendously important, and we have a whole kind of body of work around that at this point.
The only other thing that I would add is, obviously, it's a major challenge given contract negotiations and just where a lot of districts are. But I think we've been really creative around scheduling. So we have cohorts of schools, and we take the learning that comes out of those small cohorts around how do you design a school that meets all of the time requirements for various subjects, district requirements, but also allows for teacher-team collaboration. We've invested in ILTs for the past 10 years, and that's pretty much ingrained and in the bloodstream of everything that we do, so that supports a lot of the work. And our teachers, quite frankly, do a lot of planning outside of the school day, which has to happen with the amount of demands that are placed on our schools. But the only other thing that I would say around that is that we really, the network chiefs, the principals, spend a lot of time making sure that the time that you do have with teachers is sacred. So I remember when I was a teacher, we spent a lot of time doing things that maybe didn't move the needle, things that you could argue are important. But I think the narrative has changed in that when teachers come together, that time is sacred and it should be focused on student achievement, the work that we do every day. And I think that's helped with balancing the amount of time and just the amount of the demands that are placed on us every day.
Okay. Before we go to the next question, we did have one online question from somebody who's actually here, I believe, but why don't we... so they were going to get us both ways. And it was a question that indicated that recent analyses of TUDA results showed that there was really quite a strong correlation between the results the districts were getting and attendance. I think, Alan, this was your question. Could you speak to that and maybe throw in a word or two about results and what happens when you cut back on the number of suspensions that a school district does, which all contributes to kind of out of school time?
I think the author of the question is raising a follow-up. No?
Yeah.
And the data from NAEP, this was a publication from Attendance Works. The data from NAEP also show that students who are chronically absent, it's not average attendance, chronically absent, have trouble understanding their teacher. So they've got problems in the school. So if you're going to fix it, it's not just getting them to school. You're going to have to give them some supports. And two districts, particularly Miami and Chicago, if you look at the NAEP data, have relatively low rates of chronic absenteeism. And we'd be very interested in what you may be doing to address this problem.
We were determined at the beginning of this year, looking at a number of data performance indicators, that, look, you can't teach the kid who's not in the seat. So we launched two simultaneous major initiatives. One was I Attend. It's online, very easy to follow. And again, it's using success coaches, it's using school resources, support organizations to create a fail-safe mechanism that does not allow the kid to fall through the cracks, period. So we look at the child in 6th grade, 7th grade, their attendance to generate interventions by the time they get to senior high school. Why not do that? We own the data. So iAttend was a significant investment. Secondly, we launched actually 3 elements. We launched Values Matter. It was actually spending time teaching values to kids, ethical behavior to kids, the things that matter, that transcend the schoolhouse, that actually enable and facilitate easier understanding and teaching and learning when they get to school. So the issue of respect, responsibility, personal adequacy, societal adequacy, civic adequacy. We spend time teaching that. And then thirdly, and this was critical, is the kids that are often absent the most are the kids we suspend the most. And then we're surprised as to why they don't get to graduate or perform well. They're absent to begin with, and then you suspend them. And to us, it was an epidemic, and we know who gets suspended across the country. Primarily males of color, primarily African-American kids. Second in line, students with disabilities. And to me, that's really a morally and ethically offensive practice. That means I'm giving up on the kid. So we are punishing the parent, right? We are providing nothing to the kid. We're providing a burden to society because they're out there burglarizing somebody if they're not in school. So we made a decision as a matter of policy that we would eliminate traditional outdoor suspensions and created student success centers equipped with social workers, school psychologists, the best teachers with very, very small class size ratios to really understand the root causes of the problem. But as we're doing that, you're teaching the child. And in Miami-Dade, 4th largest school system in the country, 0 outdoor suspensions this year. Attendance through the roof, and you're absolutely right. Academic performance follows.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in city after city after city that are raising attendance rates and curtailing the suspensions that they've been doing.
Before we go to the next question,
Yes.
The only thing that I would add that we did in Chicago is we actually described the metric of chronic truancy because that was something that people didn't understand. And what that helped us do is really narrow our focus and zero in on the students who are more likely to be absent from school, whether that's because of family, because of discipline, whatever the root cause was. And then we basically do performance management from the district level down to the school level. But instead of, focusing on everything, attendance was a major area that we focused on. So we looked at it from the network level, at the school level. And because we were able to narrow our focus and bring some of those students back into the fold and increase their attendance rate, I think that's why we saw a dramatic increase in our attendance, throughout the district. And I do believe there's a strong correlation between students being in school and their academic achievement.
Yeah, and this again once more kind of points to the value of the Trial Urban District program in the sense that you're able to analyze the attendance data for districts on which you've got comparable reading and mathematics results to see how attendance actually affects the work. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Amara DeCure. I'm with the George Washington University. Within urban school districts across the nation, there's a real tension, both professional, it could also be called professional stress, around low-performing schools, which leads to potential state-mandated reconstitutions or takeovers or even dismantling of schools. So to what extent is that stress present in your district, and how has it impacted your district's ability to increase your TUDA scores?
Great question. We don't have any stress.
Yeah.
So I think everybody to some extent has dealt with this issue. Anybody want to?
I'll take a first stab.
Okay.
That's been one of the challenges that you have is a total reconstitution of a school causes lots of stress. So we're finishing our 3rd year of an investment strategy. And so we call them our investment schools. These are our lowest performing schools. We know that they'll have a lot of other requirements around them that they have to do at the state level also. We were able to get some waivers from some of those, but then we were also able to add in some components of a longer school day, a flexible school calendar, longer school year. One of the components that we had talked about a little bit earlier, when having that common planning time to come around as a school community, in our last contract, we added 200 minutes, we call it, each week, so that schools have the flexibility to design 200 minutes that is built into their contract where the students aren't there, that they can structure. Do they become a professional learning community for 100 of the minutes, and then 100 of the minutes they're in their core teams? But it gives the schools the flexibility around that component. I don't think there's an easy answer to your question. I think it is a very stressful environment, but I do think that districts, and you've heard it, and I've heard it from our colleagues, letting schools get a little bit more creative around their scheduling, the way that they can approach it, bring those common times when they really can come together and talk about the work, focus on the work, what is their professional narrative, their growth plan for the year, and then that escalates up. So it's not escalating down, but it's flowing both ways, and that's been a big change in how we're approaching the work in Cleveland.
Okay, just briefly from Alberto and Janice, and I want to make sure we get to everybody's question.
Yeah, I understand the question. Obviously, there's a degree of stress when, levels of government dictate upon you certain practices that can lead to school reconstitution, firing a principal, chartering the school, what have you. But, I have to say that should there not be a recognition of the stress on the community, when for decades we accepted the fact that 30% of the kids in African-American high schools would graduate, 2 out of every 3 were not graduating. And that was an early ticket to incarceration at some point in their lives. That to me is a greater level of stress. So sometimes government overreacts based on a level of communal apathy that leads to failure. I think that overreaction sometimes is punitive in nature and does not necessarily augment opportunity. But we need to recognize that stress exists on both sides of the equation. There is institutional stress that people should feel over the fact that for decades performance was not what it should be. And it disproportionately punished, victimized students of color, kids who were poor, kids who were immigrant, ELLs, and students with disabilities. So sometimes the response is too aggressive for the problem, less than strategic. But I think we should be balanced in recognizing both levels of stress. One, that we don't necessarily address, but we over-magnify the one that's punitive in nature.
Hi.
Yes.
I'm Jenny DeMonte from the American Institutes for Research. I want to go back to what you all were talking about early on, which is sort of where the rubber meets the road, and that's instruction. And you've talked a lot about what you do to make sure that your teachers actually know what to do in classrooms with students around content, at a real granular level. Like, how do you make the decision to do this rather than that, to ask this question rather than that? So you must spend a lot of time on PD that's really kind of intense, and I've seen DC. But what I'm worried about is the teacher on day one. You've just hired a brand new teacher out of who knows where. What do you do to make sure that that teacher is safe to practice on day one, that every student's going to get competent instruction? And do you train your own teachers? Like, do you have a relationship with a university or somebody else where you bring in people and teach them how to teach?
We don't change our.
I mean, I have 2 responses to that. The first one is, in general, we have done a lot of work to move from just pedagogical PD that is very general, how to kind of check for understanding in a generic way, to really moving to content-specific pedagogy around what a teacher is teaching the following week, the following day. System-wide across DC Public Schools, we have over 200 shared assignments that become the core of the professional development cycle. That's not just in reading and math, it's in science and social studies and art and music and health and PE, so that when teachers come together as a system and they're now talking about an assignment they're going to do with their kids, collecting work from it, reflecting on it, and driving that cycle. Now, these are just 4 assignments the whole year, but it provides that shared experience around the content pedagogy in the classroom for a common conversation. For new teachers, we are really moving towards, particularly out of our new Office of Instructional Practice, towards teacher residency programs, where you no longer have the first-year teacher as the teacher of record. They are expensive, of course, But it's a real belief that learning curve is just very, very steep the first 3 years. All the evidence points to that. And trying to figure out ways to scale teacher residency programs across the district.
Okay. Before we go to the microphone again, let me just ask the panel whether or not you have any questions of each other about how it is you use NAEP to improve your practice. Anybody hear anything this morning that prompts a question in your own mind?
Well, I think you had mentioned the ability to disaggregate the data by subgroup, and I'm curious other districts that have looked at that. In DC, we use that data along with other data points to realize that our African American boys, our Hispanic boys, are often performing lower than we would want or expect. And we've started things like our Empowering Males of Color initiative that's focused on mentorship, that's focused on starting our first all-boys high school next year. But I'm wondering if the disaggregated data is helpful for folks in any other way.
I would say much like you, we've looked at it and saw a lot of similar trends, not only on NAEP data, but on other assessments that we've given. So again, African American males and Latino males continue to lag behind, but there's also a large gap between our overall Latino students and African American students that we find interesting. So even amongst minorities, we see that, one group tends to perform better than others. So we just look at various data sets and ask ourselves questions about what is it that we could be doing better to close that achievement gap.
Yeah, I don't know whether the National Assessment Governing Board actually knows this or not, but the council used the NAEP data some years ago to disaggregate by race and gender to identify the nature of the academic trends, particularly with African American males. And it was the NAEP data that helped informed the initiative that we ultimately put on the table that got folded into My Brother's Keeper and other initiatives that the administration is pursuing. So NAEP actually provided all kinds of ammunition for how it is we kind of looked at ourselves and the work that we were doing. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Michelle Craves. I'm with Washington Partners, and I'm also a proud product of Miami-Dade Public Schools.
What high school?
Miami Killian.
Killian, all right.
We expect a particularly good question here.
My question is, how are your districts using NAEP data to improve the success of students with disabilities? Are there particular programs that you have in place that you've been able to create because of the data that you've seen?
I mean, it folds with what they just said. NAEP is a terrific tool of triangulation. Mm-hmm. So it's one more specific input that through data disaggregation, we're able to see what's gender specific, race, socioeconomic status, or disability, and compare that data to other performance elements, whether it's the state assessment, our own baseline assessments, our own interim assessments. It's one more significant input. The difference in the power of NAEP is that you're now not only comparing yourself to yourself, as we do in the case of interim assessments, yourself to the state and other cohort districts in the state of Florida via the state assessment, but now you're using a comparative tool that allows you to gauge your students' performance in a disaggregated manner across the country. Yeah. And there is power in that. So for us, there's power in the connection. So often there are elements of data that agree with one another, meaning NAEP, FSA, which is the state's assessment, as well as other national indicators. Sometimes there's a power of dissonance, an element of dissonance, where NAEP forces us to ask the question, why is the performance on a state assessment or our own interim assessments different than what's reflected here? And is what's reflected here congruent with the performance across the country, or is our own performance really an outlier? And that puts us in a position then of engaging curriculum mapping, study guide, common planning in targeted areas that are a result, as I said, of the triangulation of all available data elements.
All right, this is going to be our last question.
I'm Arnold Goldstein, NAEP staff retired, now with CRP. And first of all, thanks for this really interesting discussion. I was wondering if there are any products or formats or other types of informational products that NAEP might produce that would be very useful in the TUDA environment and to you all.
Yeah, let's broaden this question out a little bit and also ask whether or not you have any recommendations to the National Assessment Governing Board or NCES about how it is the TUDA program could be enhanced.
Well, I've just learned about the program, recently. Not NAEP, but more so TUDA and how we bring out a separate group. So, I don't have a lot of feedback or suggestions. The one thing that I heard from questions and once everyone spoke is that there is a focus on kind of the non-cognitive factors that help with student success. And I'm not sure if that's an area of focus that you would want to zero in on. I know we focus on the academic piece, but perhaps it might make sense for other large urban districts to share what they're doing around some of these non-cognitive areas that we know have a great impact on student achievement.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I wonder about the power that what we are doing here is essentially creating a learning community. I mean, it's an exceptionally public one, but that, one of the revelations I've been having is that professional development and professional learning and change management are not distinguishable. They shouldn't be distinguishable. They are essentially one and the same. And that people undertake the learning for change management by collaborating with job-alike peers. And I wonder, not structurally with TUDA, but sort of using the power of convening authority to bring together job-alike folks in a way similar to this to do some sort of consultancies and learning about the structures that we've used to engage in change management in our respective districts.
So, Brian, do you want to tell them about the Chief Academic Officers meeting in July?
We've
got just the meeting for you.
A little bit.
Oh, God.
So, yeah.
Oh, I would just say with an increasing discussion nationwide around assessment fatigue and making sure that we have assessment that's worthy of action and giving us information. From the NAEP items the actual items that I've looked at, I think the board could do a job nationwide of sharing how these are items that demand students to do the cognitive work and to think. And I think as we look at assessment across the board, not just NAEP, to really push the conversation around are the tasks and the items that we're confronting students with the type that reflect that are worthy of high quality teaching and learning in the classroom. And from my experience, the NAEP items reflect high quality teaching and learning in the classroom, not discrete skills, memorization, lower level thinking, but deeper thinking and understanding of content.
Mike, as an NAGB board member, I'm going to be giving self-advice based on your question. There's always a lot of excitement and attention at the time of data release. And certainly NCES and the council specific to TUDA and NAGB, NAEP in general, a lot of excitement. The question, I think, and I think you address it, is in between data releases, the power of these organizations in terms of creating greater awareness and centralizing sort of the depository for best practices could be augmented. So it should not be a mystery. You should make it easier for the nation to understand what the best practices in Boston, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Cleveland happen to be, Miami, of course. And I think sometimes it's not easy to understand what those are. So if it's 4th, 8th grade reading mathematics, if it's parental engagement, if it's the issue of fidelity of curriculum implementation, data analysis, wouldn't it be wonderful for stronger collaboration to develop a clearinghouse for best practices that is used and usable in between data releases for the benefit of the country?
Great suggestion. So with that, we are going to wrap up this panel, but I have to say that I'm very proud of the urban districts that are making such substantial progress on the national assessment. I'm proud of all of the districts that have volunteered for this assessment, and I know even urban school districts that are not a part of the trial urban district assessment use the results from urban school districts that are part of the program to help drive their own curriculum reforms and other academic improvements. Since we first started this effort some 12, 13 years ago, at this point, you might have noticed that the large cities, which is a variable that is measured as part of the NAEP release, we have actually cut the gap with the nation as a whole almost in half over that period of time. So the large urban school districts are using NAEP, they are using each other, and they're using a variety of other partners and tools in this relentless effort to improve outcomes for our kids. None of us got into this work to see our schools simply reflect, much less perpetuate, all of the inequities and barriers that our urban schools have. We got into this work to provide the highest academic standards and to provide excellence for all of our kids, and NAEP is really helping us do that. With that, could we give our panel a round of applause? Thank you very much. And with that, let me welcome Bill Bouchard back to the podium.
Well, I can't remember the last time I've heard so many concrete examples and ideas of what school leaders are doing on the ground this morning. It was an exceptional opportunity to hear those things. I also, when you read about, when the reporters write about and share information about NAEP, you'll almost always see, in the same sentence, you'll see NAEP, and then you'll see the gold standard in assessment. And you see that because of the exceptional leadership and the work at NCES and Peggy Carr and her team, ensuring that these results are absolutely accurate. It's the best assessment for student performance in the country. And it's their work and the work of the folks that support them that make that happen. And we think about that in the abstract, right? We think about, okay, these scores are going up, and that's a good thing. But we don't think about the reality of the thousands of children in these school districts who are better prepared for the classes that they're going to take next year. And they're better prepared to go to college and have careers, and they're better prepared for life because of the work of these people up here on this stage, and the teachers and the others, and the parents in their school districts. And we sometimes forget that. Last comment I'd like to share is, as we can see today, leadership matters. Every single panelist here today talked about leadership in their buildings. But we can clearly see examples of extraordinary and outstanding leadership right in front of us here at the district level. So join me again in thanking our panelists and particularly, before you do, particularly the leadership of Mike Casserly at the Council of Great City Schools. We would not be here today and talking about this if it weren't for Mike Casserly's leadership. So please. Remember that there's much more information about the performance and the efforts for the urban school districts that are represented here and others at our website, nationsreportcard.gov. So we encourage you to go there, and there'll be additional materials there. And on behalf of the governing board, of which Alberto is a member and a leader, we thank you for joining us today in person and on the webinar. Thank you very much.